Oh, so I've been going in to the YouTube videos and putting the passage on it, and I made a playlist. So there is a Matthew playlist, but it didn't start till Matthew 8 because I didn't go back and try to figure out the old ones. But I'm going to keep up from now on. So there's a Sunday school playlist and there's a service playlist. And I'll keep them organized and make new playlists when we get to books. Are we good? All right. What's that? No, that's right where you usually are. I think I'm a little closer maybe. Yeah. All right, I'm going to open us in prayer. Woo! Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for the blessings that you give us every single day, Father. I thank you for the good news that on the 24th, things are getting, for some people, back to normal, and for everybody else, a lot closer. And I look forward to not having to deal with all that stuff. And I just thank you for the opportunities that we have to be here, and your word, your spirit, your church, and your son. And we just pray that we would leave here being more like him than when we came. We pray these things in Christ's name and always for his sake. Amen. All right, so today my plan is to kind of wrap up Genesis chapter 2. And so we have talked about the idea of the Toledat and the internal structure of the book of Genesis and how that relates. And actually we have one coming up here pretty soon that's going to be the exception to the rule. And then we talked about, excuse me, I'm going to cough. We talked about the Azir and the special creation of Eve. And then now we're going to be wrapping up that discussion here today, looking at these last two verses of Genesis chapter 2. And so this is so we have Adam. God has made Adam. God has introduced him to the Garden of Eden, and that he's going to take care of it. And then God has brought to Adam all of these nefesh creatures that he's going to be in relationship with, and he has named them. And through that process, Adam realized that there wasn't any other life in the creative order that was like him. And then God makes Eve. And then Adam sees Eve, and his response is in verse 23. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." And now he understands that Eve is like him. Okay, she's more than this biological life of the garden. She's more than the nefesh life of the animals, but she is life like him to come alongside of him. And then we have this statement in verse 24 and 25 of Genesis chapter 2. It says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." And it's that first phrase, the verse 24, that I want to camp out on here today. And what I want to do is, I want to look at this verse through the lens of its New Testament understanding. And we're going to look at two passages. We're going to look at Matthew 19, and this is going to be the way that Jesus understood what is going on here in this verse. And we are going to be looking in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and I'll give you more the exact verses when we get there. Why did I just do that again? Whew. 6. And we'll look at how Paul understood these verses, because I think looking at the way Jesus understood this verse and the way that Paul understood this verse is going to kind of unpack for us the significance of what's going on right here. Okay? And then I'm trying to be good about estimating what we're going to get done. So this is all I'm planning for today. So we'll see where we go from there. All right, so the first thing in looking at this text, I think I want to look at Jesus and his understanding of what is happening right here and how important that is. And that is going to be in Matthew chapter 19. And the whole discussion is this paragraph in verses 3 through 9. But chiefly, I want to look at verse 4. That's kind of the piece that is super important. But we'll look at the whole context, okay? So, Jesus has just wrapped up a section where he is talking about, in Matthew chapter 18, he's talking about the relationships that we have with one another. All right, and then chapter 19 starts in verse 1. Now when Jesus has finished these sayings, so again, all that stuff he's talking about in chapter 18, he's going to go off, he's going to leave Galilee, he's going to enter the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. Okay? All right, so verse 3, we have, and Pharisees came to him and tested him. All right? And so they're coming along and they're trying to figure out where Jesus is at. All right? And so this is specific, they're going to ask him a question about divorce. All right? And this is a passage I think many people are familiar with. Okay? Well, when we look at it within the teachings at the time. Oh, sorry. Becky, go ahead. Oh, wait, no, don't go ahead. Jeremiah! Yeah! Go give that to your mother. Thank you so much.
I was just wondering.
It's on.
Okay.
It's on.
Just wondering if you could just talk for a minute about single people. Because if I was a single woman, I'd be thinking well, if God made me from man to help man, and I'm not married, am I supposed to be helping men in general?
Okay. Yeah. I guess the answer to that question is God did not make women to help men. God made wives to help husbands. And so if you are a single woman, because you are a single woman, you are not, there's not an aspect of your purpose that you're missing out on. In the same way, if you're a single man, there's not an aspect of your purpose that you're missing out on. This is one of those areas that I think, it'll kind of specifically connect to what we're talking about here in a little bit. The way that, I guess in a quick summary, the way we're supposed to look at it is if we are, the way I think we're supposed to look at it, and this is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 mostly, that if we are single, we are supposed to take advantage of our singleness to be able to put the kingdom at a higher level of priority. And this is true. I remember in college we had a guy who came into a convocation and he was talking about the gift of singleness, and he was basically saying, look, he's looking out at everybody there and he's like, look, I don't know if you guys have the gift of singleness. But he said, but right now I know that 99% of you out there are single. So act like you have the gift of singleness. Take advantage of the fact that you are single to do something in the kingdom that married people can't do. And a lot of people got mad at him. They didn't like that. They liked the whole God's going to give you a spouse and you got to pray. And they didn't like the whole you're single, act like you're single. And so I think the principle is it's while we are in a certain state, if you are a single person, then take advantage of the fact that you're single and do something for the kingdom that you wouldn't normally be. And if you are a married person, then you got to recognize the fact that there may be times in your life where you're not going to be able to do something in the kingdom because you're married and because you have a spouse. And if you have kids, I think that's especially true too. And it's part of that seasons of life thing. But if you are a single person, you are not less than a married person. In fact, there's a way in which you have a greater capacity to serve in the kingdom. And you got to remember, Jesus was single. Paul was single. You look at the people who, part of Paul's testimony to his apostleship was the fact that he, both in suffering and in ministry, was able to experience a greater degree in both of those things than other apostles. And part of that was because he was single. Paul could suffer the things he suffered because he didn't have a spouse that he had to bring into those things with him. And he was able to accomplish the things he was able to accomplish in his ministry because he didn't have the responsibility of a spouse and a family. So if you're single, you have a capacity to participate in kingdom life that has a greater degree of freedom than someone who is married. And so I think it's the idea, it shouldn't be I'm single, I should figure out how I can get married because everybody needs to get married. I think it's I am single, so what can I do in my singleness? And then in my journey and in my relationship with God, if I have that opportunity to be married, then I need to kind of go into that with wisdom and make a good decision. And it's not to say that you should be married or you shouldn't be married, but it's something that we need to have wisdom about. And if you're single and you want to be married, great. But if you are single, your number one priority should be, how do I impact the kingdom, not how do I get married. And pursuing marriage is fine, but it's got to be kind of within that hierarchy. And then if you're married, you got to recognize that you have less freedom in your ability to impact the kingdom, because you have a specific calling to impact your spouse and impact your kids. And so there needs to be a focus there. All right, follow up.
Yeah, and Paul said that it was better for the widows to not get married unless they were young, right?
Yeah.
He said they'd be happier if they were not remarried.
Yeah. And I think some of that is human nature, some of that's cultural. Yep. Okay, so divorce. All right, so right here, the way I understand it, and I'm pretty sure I have this straight. So we've already reached the point within Orthodox Judaism that we have separated the rabbinical traditions into the traditions of Hillel and the traditions of Shammai. All right, and within that context, as a general rule, Shammai was more on the conservative end, and Hillel was more on what we would describe as the liberal end, though that's not always bad. I think generally most people look at Hillel's interpretation as being the one that is more like Christ's, though in this particular example that is not the case, because Shammai taught that the only reason you could divorce your spouse was some forms of sexual issue, whereas Hillel taught that there was a lot more reasons that one could divorce your spouse. And this was a debate at the time. And so they're coming and they're asking Jesus where he falls on this, and this is an example where he actually is with Shammai and closer to that end of the spectrum. And so they come and they say to him, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? Okay, and this is what Hillel was saying. And again, it's not any cause, but there was quite the list. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. All right? And so Jesus is quoting Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. All right? And so how does Jesus understand Genesis 2:24? And the two things that I think are really important is, the first is that Jesus says that he who created them said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother. This statement here, this is God speaking. This is not like an editorial comment. This is not something that Moses put in there to explain something. That, okay, guys, by the way, in case you didn't get it, this is the first marriage. In the historical event of God, through special creation, bringing Eve into the created order, he then verbalized this statement. God spoke it. Okay? So it's part of the narrative. It happened there as part of the historical account of the creation of Eve. Okay? So this is a statement from God, which is interesting because it starts with a therefore. All right? So what's the cute little saying? When you have a therefore, you have to see what the therefore is there for. God is making a response. He's saying, because of something that happened, I'm attaching a truth to that. And God is responding to this statement that Adam just made. Okay, so we go through this whole process. God goes through this whole process of helping Adam to understand the significance of Eve. Okay, and then Adam says, this at last is flesh of my flesh, bones of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And God says, yes, okay, Adam, you got it. And therefore, because she is like you, because she is life like you, Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So it's a response. Adam realizes Eve, who Eve is. She's not like the plants. She's not like the Nefesh animals. She is like me. She is woman. She's on the same level as me. She's the same type of life as me. And so because God says, okay, because now you understand that Eve is like you, that she is unique and different than all this other aspect of creation, and you are going to have a unique relationship with her that's going to be different than the relationship you have with the rest of creation. Therefore, I pronounce you man and wife. Okay? And so this is God. God is officiating this first marriage. Okay? And part of this process that God went through in creating Eve the way he did was so that they could get to this point where now Adam and Eve would understand this new relationship that he was now calling them into. Okay? And according to Jesus, what God did when he spoke this over Adam and Eve, when he officiated this, he did something where he now made them one. Okay, this is what, this is Jesus' doctrine on divorce is based on the fact that when God said this, they are no longer two but one flesh, what therefore God is joined together, let not man separate. So there is a joining together by God. God did something when he officiated this marriage that is outside of Adam and Eve and what they did. Okay, and this is why I was talking before about marriage is a covenant relationship, not just between a husband and a wife, but also God. Like God stepped in and took two people and created a relationship that didn't exist before. That, Jesus says, because of what God did, whatever it is he did, we're going to talk more about that in a minute, human beings should not try to undo that. Okay? And again, this is the culminating point of this entire process. Like God wanted Adam and Eve to understand the significance of this new relationship that he was bringing them together. So he created Eve in such a way so that Adam would understand there's nothing else in creation that's like her. The relationship that I'm going to have with her is going to be unique and different and more significant than any of these other relationships I'm going to have in the created order. Jeremiah, did you have a question or were you just stretching? You're okay. All right. So how did Jesus, when Jesus was reading Genesis 1, how did he understand it? One, he understood that God was actually speaking here. And that in God speaking this, he was taking two people and joining them together in a relationship in an active sense. God was actually doing something to bring two people together in a relationship that didn't exist before. Okay? All right, and then when we put that in the context of Genesis, again, that makes this whole thing like, this is the point of Genesis chapter 2. This is what all this is going to. God ordered creation so that Adam and Eve would understand that they were now in a very special and very unique relationship. Okay? All right. Now, I want to explore, because Jesus, he says God took two people and put them together, but he doesn't really explain like what that means. I think Paul is going to give us some more information about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. All right. Okay, so 1 Corinthians. Chapter 6, and we are going to look at the paragraph that starts in verse 12 and goes to the end of the chapter, so verse 12 through 20. And things are going to get a little, I'm going to try to walk through this and explain what's going on. But we are in a section here of, this is 1 Corinthians, where Paul is addressing, so in chapter 7, he's going to start addressing specific questions that the Corinthian church had that they asked him about. But in chapters 1 through 6, he is addressing issues from the church that have been reported to him. Okay, and one of the issues that he's addressing right here is that he has been told that there are members of the Corinthian church who are still participating in the ritual prostitution at the temple of Aphrodite, which was in Corinth. Okay, and as part of the normal, healthy religious observation of Greco-Roman men, is when you went to worship, you went and you would pay for a temple prostitute and you would be intimate with that person. Okay? And that's how you worshipped Aphrodite. And so members of the church are still participating in this. Okay? They were doing it before they got saved, they're still doing it. Okay? They're baby Christians. They're still living the same way they did before they got saved. All right, and so now Paul's addressing this. And what I want to, in addressing this issue, Paul is going to quote this text in Genesis 2:24. All right? And so the way he's using it in relation to this issue, I think, is important for us to understand what is going on here. Okay? So here's what he says. It takes a little while to lead into it. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach, and the stomach meant for food. And God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord, and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, from whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. All right, so in the middle there, Paul quoted from Genesis chapter 2. Okay, the two will become one flesh. And what's interesting about this, so specifically, when he says in verse 16, or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? That, what is translated there in English as joined, that is literally in Greek, hold fast. Paul is making reference to this statement here in Genesis. Okay, he's using the Greek words, but he's using the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew words. So Paul, again, in alluding to this, and we know it because he quotes it specifically, the one flesh piece. So when Paul, he understands this idea of hold fast, this is being sexual intimacy. He's using that term synonymously. And that this idea of one flesh, is the result of, this is what happens when people are sexually intimate. Okay? And so, when God said, therefore, a man shall leave his mother and father and hold fast to his wife, God was, according to Paul, the way Paul understands it, God was saying to them, a man shall leave his parental authorities and experience intimacy with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There's something that happens between two people in the process of sexual intimacy that results in this idea of being one flesh. Okay? But what does that mean? All right? And so Paul is in here, he's walking through a couple of different relationships. And he's trying to help us understand, or help the Corinthian church understand, this is a terrible thing that you guys are doing by practicing this ritual prostitution. Okay? And so he talks about the relationship that we have with Christ. Okay? So he says there's Christians. Okay, and then there's Christ. And it's we are members of his body. Okay? That's the language he's using to describe this relationship that we have with Christ. Okay? And then he is saying that you have Christians that are becoming members of a prostitute. And he's saying there's a parallel relationship. That when these Corinthian Christians are being intimate with a prostitute, they are creating a relationship with that prostitute that is a similar relationship to the relationship that they have with Christ. And he even puts it in this, like he says that in verse 15, shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never! Exclamation point. He's saying that because these relationships have this similarity, he's saying you're taking the members of Christ and making them the members of a prostitute. Like it's impacting in some way this aspect, this relationship with Christ. And I think what he's talking, he throws the word body around here a lot, okay? And I think what he's talking about here is it's less about the physical and it's more about this relationship that we have as the body of the Christ, as the church. Okay, and I think this because, he says in verse, 13, okay, the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And we have to ask ourselves, how is the Lord for the body? And I don't think he's saying that the Lord is for the physical body. But I think he's saying the Lord is for the body, the church. The church, the body of the church is for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. And so when he's saying taking the members of Christ, he's talking about like us. We are the members of Christ's body. And we are making that connection with the prostitute. We're becoming one flesh. And Paul is looking to this verse in Genesis and saying, look, this is what happens. When you are intimate with a prostitute, you are now creating a connection. You're creating a relationship with this person that is similar to, that's on the same dimension as, that exists in the same realm as the relationship that you have with Christ being part of his body. Jeremiah, can you take the mic over to Doug? And then I'm going to try to draw this back to something we were talking about in Genesis chapter 1.
Do you think there's the connection besides more than the prostitute, but the connection of Christ with the temple?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because he gets into, and again, you don't see this unless you understand the exact context. These are temple prostitutes. And he makes a connection to us being the temple of God later. So you are taking the temple of God and you're associating it with the temple of pagan deity. Like he connects it right into worship. And I think so. What's going on here is again, when we looked at Genesis chapter 1, and I spent all that time talking about the three types of life. He's saying, and the Bible, life is about relationships. Okay, we have a relationship with biological life, we eat it, And then the nefesh life, we have those meaningful, reciprocal, emotional relationships. But then there is that dimension of spiritual life, we have a relationship with God. And so that relationship that we have with Christ here, in the spiritual aspect of life, the relationships that are formed between people through sexual intimacy are spiritual relationships. They're in the same dimension of life as our relationship with Christ. They're not just biological, they're not just social, they're also spiritual. All right? And that's part of the uniqueness of the relationship between Adam and Eve that Adam needed to understand. She's more than the biological relationship, she's more than the nefesh relationships. The relationship that he has with Eve as his spouse is in the same dimension as the relationship that he was going to have with God. Becky.
So, like when in the Old Testament, when the Israelites would go after other idols, like God was calling it like adultery.
Yeah, he does. Yes. He puts idolatry as a relationship in the same sphere. He has us understand it through the relationships that we have with our spouses.
And I think just like bad religion has just made sex something that's dirty and bad, that to put God and sex in the same sentence just seems blasphemy. But like God had no problem talking about himself and his people in that way and in those terms, and it just seems just like creepy. I'm going
to come back around and hit that idea again in a little bit, because I think it's really important.
Yeah. And I think we're missing out on a really clear picture of our relationship with God when we just don't even let ourselves.
I'm heading in that direction.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, can you bring the mic up to Chris?
I think it's ironic that the perverted idolaters realized sexual relationships was a spiritual entity.
They incorporated it right into their worship. Yeah. I'll take it. Yeah. Well, and I think so. I guess this again, Paul. The point that Paul is making is he's saying that this, the perversion of godly sexual intimacy into this pagan worship was so bad because of the way that it paralleled the relationship that we have with Christ. And so he's trying to express this to the Corinthians to get them to understand, like, when you go and do this, you are, I guess, the way that like Chris and Becky were talking about it, like you are, you're participating in this idolatrous worship. You're relating to a human being in sin in the same dimension as your relationship with God and Christ. But to put that in a positive light. Okay, well, before I get there, so obviously Paul is saying that there's a connection that's made. The Christian and the prostitute are one flesh. But Jesus was saying here that God is putting two things together. Paul is saying here that these two things are being put together. But are these two things being put together by God? And I think the answer to that is no. But like, what is going on here? And here's what I'm submitting to you. When we go back and we look at Genesis chapter 1, okay, God, in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 1, we get introduced to these three types of life: biological life, nefesh life, spiritual life. In Genesis chapter 2, God brings Adam through a personal introduction to all these types of life. He plants the garden, puts Adam in it to take care of it. He then brings all the nefesh creatures to Adam. Adam names them. And then he goes through this whole process so that Adam understands that Eve is different than all of that. And then makes this statement: they're married. Adam and Eve relate on a spiritual level. The relationship between Adam and Eve as a married couple is closer to Adam's relationship with God than it is Adam's relationship with the animals. Okay? And God, through intimacy, they're becoming one flesh, but then God is also taking two people and bringing them together in a way that they weren't together before. And I was trying to think of how wrapping my mind around this, and I think, are you guys familiar with the concept of a trellis? It's a gardening thing. I don't do gardening, but my dad did for a long time. And it has to do with things that are primarily like vine stuff, like grapes, beans, tomatoes, and that kind of stuff. And this is the way I understand it. Like, if you know how to grow beans, when you plant the beans, you also put it's like a fancy fence thing over there, so that when those beans grow up, there's a framework for them to work themselves around so that they can produce healthy fruit. And if you don't put that there, when the plant grows, it doesn't grow in a way that is able to produce healthy fruit. Am I correct in my understanding of how this works in gardening? Okay, so I think what we see is, okay, we have sexual intimacy, we have marriage. When two people enter into this concept of covenant marriage before God, and he brings something together, that's like marriage is like the trellis for sexual intimacy. Sexual intimacy connects people in the spiritual dimensions of life. And the kingdom marriage is the framework around which healthy sexual intimacy can grow. And without that framework of kingdom marriage, of God bringing these people together, then sexual intimacy cannot be healthy in a relationship between two people. And without that healthy sexual intimacy growing into that framework, then that kingdom marriage won't be healthy. And so what God does when two people come together and they enter into marriage as an institution, as a covenant, God is creating in this relationship the framework for healthy sexual intimacy, for a healthy relationship in this spiritual dimension of life that is of a similar fashion to the spiritual relationship we have with God. And I think this is why when we get into the New Testament and we look at marriage as a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church, that's what Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. When he's saying we are members of Christ's body, he's talking about the relationship between Christ and the church. And the reason why the relationship of a married couple can represent the relationship between Christ and the church, because the relationship between Christ and the church is a relationship in the spiritual dimension of life. And the relationship between a husband and wife is a relationship in the spiritual dimension of life. And it is through people looking at Christian married couples who are experiencing a relationship that's more than the biological, that's more than the social, that's on the spiritual dimensions of life, it can give them a picture of a relationship with God that's more than biological, that's more than social, that's in the spiritual dimensions of life. And that is super important. Okay, and that's why marriage and sexual intimacy is held of such high regard in Scripture, because it is a picture of the relationship that someone can have with God in the spiritual dimensions of life. And that was, again, so the lesson, like Adam needed to understand that the relationship he was going to have with his wife was going to be on a level that was greater than the relationships he was going to have with anything else in the created order. Because, and again, this is where we get into like ideas of evangelism. Like someday, Adam's and Eve's kids, they were going to learn in part what it looked like to have a relationship with God and what it meant to have a relationship with God through witnessing the relationship between Adam and Eve in their marriage. It was part of the gospel. It was part of how we communicate. What does it mean to have a spiritual relationship? What does it mean to have a relationship with God? And marriage, the covenant marriage, where God takes two people and brings them together, creates the framework for a healthy expression of sexual intimacy, where two people step beyond of just a biological relationship, step beyond just a soulish, emotional, cognitive relationship, but step into a relationship in the actual spiritual dimensions of life. All right, Becky, did you want to throw something in? Okay. So, and again, so this is why, and I think, so, getting marriage right and sexual intimacy right is really important because I think the way I'm looking at it, the way I'm understanding it, is that it's an integral part of the communication of the gospel, of displaying what spiritual relationships look like.
So we can see that from Jesus, from Paul. You can also see it from Peter in 1 Peter 3, that our relationship with our spouse has to be proper or our prayers will be hindered.
Yes. He's talking to Christian husbands that have wives that aren't Christians or not being faithful. And he says, you got to treat them with respect or your prayers will be hindered. The way that the husband relates to his wife has impact on the way the husband relates to God the Father as the recipient of his prayers. And again, I think it's because we're talking about relationships within this aspect of life, the spiritual, and they impact each other. In the same way that our biological relationships impact each other, in the same way that our social relationships impact each other. And healthy social relationships in one place lead to healthy social relationships in another place, but unhealthy social relationships in one aspect of life lead to unhealthy social relationships in other aspects of life. That's going to be true of our spiritual relationships too. And so by pursuing healthy spiritual relationships with my wife, which is a unique relationship that I do not have with any other human being, I both picture and I influence my relationship with Christ. And again, it's that whole, like, the relationship that we have with God is the most profound relationship we have that echoes into every other aspect of our life. The relationship we have with our spouse is the most profound relationship we have with another human being. And I think because that is the only relationship we have with another human being that goes beyond these other aspects of life into the spiritual aspect of life, which is why sexual immorality can have such drastic consequences in our lives, because we are creating trauma in the spiritual dimension of life. And I think this is what is so crazy about it. So the world right now, we're in this mode where sex, it's purely biological, it has no significance. And what the Bible is saying is that no, that sexual intimacy is this thing in creation that cuts across all dimensions of life. It's a really big deal. And it's even in that same realm as our relationship with Christ himself. And unhealth in those relationships can impact the health we have in our relationship with Christ. And I think and I don't have the answers to this, but I think it's something to think about and talk about when we have is, I think because we recognize the profound holiness of sexual intimacy, in an effort to motivate young people to experience that in marriage, vilify is not the right word, but we've kind of like tabooed it, or even made it, it's the whole like, don't think about it, don't talk about it, don't experience it, and then go enjoy it with your spouse. And it's almost this idea that as long as the number one most important thing for you to be is sexually pure when you get married, and if you do that, your marriage is going to be successful and happy, and you're going to figure it all out, it's going to be great. And at least, from my experience, it doesn't always work that way. And we can create a foundation where we set people up to have just a really hard time with that. And when we see that, like, if healthy, holy sexual intimacy is essential for healthy, holy kingdom marriage, I think we have to find a way to support that better. To again put the absolute correct amount of emphasis of this is super important and it's super dangerous. You don't want to mess around with it. And God's will for you is to maintain sexual purity until you can experience marriage. But then also, here's how you can have a really healthy expression of sexual intimacy when you are married, so that your marriage can be healthy and be a proper gospel representation of the relationship between Christ and the church. And trying to that's a tightrope, and just kind of figuring that out. And as me as a parent right now, like the world, like if you want to beat the world to communicating sex to your children, you got to get in there real early. Because the world is just bombarding us all the time with this super distorted, it's not a big deal, it's not important, it's just biological, everybody does it, blah, 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 no consequences. And that's just super dangerous, because this is one of the most profound things that we have in creation. And we flipped it back over. All right, so Jeremiah, take this to Becky, and then you're going to take it over to Aunt Julie. Thank you, my child.
So I think, like, people are afraid, or just people I've talked to anyways, right? They're afraid of talking with their kids about it because they say, oh, it'll ruin their innocence, take away their innocence, or whatever. And I don't think that's true at all. I think, like, when they experience it, like, through abuse or just, they're watching dirty movies, like, I think that steals innocence, but just knowing the truth doesn't, because, like, kids used to grow up on farms watching the chickens do it, right? So I don't know. I mean, obviously
yeah.
there needs to be an age
I think there is an age.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it kind of gets in this, because we saw the man and his wife were naked and they were not ashamed. I think now they're on the other side of the fall. There's a connection within humanity between nakedness and vulnerability and shame. Like I can see it in all of, there's a developmental point in the lives of children where before they do not care if people see them naked, and they even prefer nudity. Like my kids would be home and then, like it's all gone. But then I can know with all of them a distinct point where they no longer wanted people to see them naked. And so I think there is and so I get, like, if you ever wanted to try to figure out what the age of accountability is, I would say, like, when your child is now thinks it's not okay for people to see them without clothes on, you're right in there, okay? Because now shame is starting to enter into the way they look at the world. But I think the danger is, again, like, you got to make sure that you don't want a child's first interaction with sexual intimacy to be under the shepherding of Satan. The shepherding of Satan. Like, part of the world deception, part of the deception that Satan is trying to get into the minds of every human being is that sex is not important. And he is targeting our children. He wants our children to believe this lie, because the best way to screw up someone's future is to, and marriage and that kind of stuff, is to get them sexually active at a young age. And that's build a lot of trauma that they're going to have a hard time getting over later in life. And so we have to find that balance between finding, like, when is the right time, in the right way, in the right amount, to start shepherding our children in this. Because if we don't do it, the world is going to do it. And we can, I was talking to someone today, and it doesn't matter how many filters you have on how many devices, kids figure out how to get past them. It just takes one kid, and then they tell everybody. So, like, there has to be both an active protection, but then an active shepherding, or else the whole thing is going to get out of whack. We'll do Julie, then hop over to Doug.
I wasn't done, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, and I think, like, early education also protects them when they know that, when they know how things work and they know what all their different parts are called, like, they're more protected from predators and they can speak out, when there's danger. And I think it's, I think it's a healthy thing, not a feeling during innocence kind of
Yeah.
thing. And definitely in our marriage, ignorance didn't do us any favors.
No. Well, I think there is an unhealthy way of doing it too early.
Yeah,
And there are healthy ways of doing it.
My parents protected me, and I know they prevented a lot of bad stuff from happening to me, which I'm very thankful for.
Yeah.
But some education would have been helpful too.
Okay, and then on Julie, and then over to Doug again.
So my question is along the same line as what you were just talking about. When
Yeah.
we read or understand that they say as many as 40% of young girls have suffered some type of sexual trauma through abuse or within their family or
Yeah.
friends, how as a church do we reach out to that, and how do we teach girls that their purity is not linked to their worth?
Yeah, and I think that's the big one. I think that's the other edge of the two-edged sword, is I think in the church there has been a connection between purity and worth, and it's almost kind of, if you, I think sometimes even, and again, I think I'm not saying that these things are being specifically communicated, but these are the things that kids are, the truths, the lies that they're getting caught up in. And it's the idea, like, if you're not a virgin when you get married, you're doomed to a second-class marriage. I remember talking or having an interaction where there was a young lady who struggled with masturbation, and they were in a Sunday school class, and they were doing it was like a Christian sex thing, and there was a section about it. And they were really excited because they're like, nobody's ever talked to me about this before. And they got to it, and the teacher said, oh, nobody here does that, and they skipped it. And so immediately the shame came down. And so now that person feels like, I am less of a Christian now because I struggle with this experience. And so we got to find that way of both, again, like upholding the profound beauty of marriage and sexual intimacy, but also finding that in there that, like, your value as a human being is more than the mistakes that you make, and there is forgiveness. But then at the same token, you're not swinging so hard that way that we remove all consequences. You know, because I did not practice sexual purity in my teenage years, and then so because I brought trauma into our marriage, and that was me. That was consequences of choices that I made. My wife didn't make those choices for me, And even some of it, like, it was stuff that I didn't even recognize until much later in my life. And so my wife and I, we both, because of different backgrounds, we brought trauma related to sexual intimacy in our marriage. And because of the lies that we were believing, where we're not even recognizing that trauma, it took us like 7 or 8 years before we got to the point where we could even recognize the trauma to be able to figure out, how do we get healing in this area? And it was a long time. 3 of my kids were born in that period of time. And we can look at unhealthy aspects of our marriage at that time and see how that's impacted our kids in certain areas. So it's really important. But again, it's like anything in life anything that's really powerful is also really dangerous. And learning how to handle things with wisdom and respect in a safe way takes a lot of work, and it's hard. And this is what part of the thing that we're called as both parents and as a church to help people walk through. And so not, finding a way not to diminish the significance of marriage and intimacy, either in a positive way or a negative way. But I think especially now for young people, I think if we're going to lean in any direction, I think it's in the trying to kind of build people up. So we got the whole, like, sex is not nothing. It's not just biological. But finding that balance of even though this is something that can really mess you up, like, we serve a great God of healing and forgiveness. And healing and forgiveness is available. And especially, this is the part of, I think we intended to motivate kids that being sexually intimate before marriage is a really big deal, but we didn't create that safety net for like, what if it wasn't your fault, and what if you were abused? And some people, and Satan took an opportunity to get some lies in there. To be like, well, you heard all this stuff that the pastor said, and so look at you, and that's not great. That's not good. And we got to figure out a way to kind of work through that. And I mean, it was like 20 years ago, they were saying that kids are going to have their first experience with sexual intimacy by the time they're in the 6th grade. So it's got to be lower than that now. So, I mean, if you think that your kids haven't been exposed to it, they probably have. I mean, Maria has come home and said things that classmates have said to her that I'm like, wish I could strangle that kid. Satan's been doing this kind of thing for a long time, and it's part of, again, I don't try to not to get into the conspiracy theory stuff, but there is an organized, evil, demonic system that is trying to get people to believe a lie. And one of the lies that the world is specifically targeting children with is that sex is not a big deal. And it's doing it to adults too. I mean, how many Christian adults are dealing with issues of sexual immorality, of pornography, of unhealthy sexual relationships in marriage, and all that kind of stuff? Kids are not going to have a better situation with that. It really agrees with the kids at school, like the stuff that they joke about, and the stuff that they're exposed to, and like the middle school and teenagers that are reading Game of Thrones. I just want to like take parents and, this is not appropriate for your child. It's not appropriate for you either. But if you're an adult, you're going to make your decision. But I'm like, don't let your kid read this book. Don't let your kid watch this show. But we're so disconnected. We don't. Yeah, guys. Right now, I'm just kind of, unless I know what it is, I just assume it's going to be inappropriate. Can we get the mic over to Doug, because I want him to be able to throw in before we're done. And I guess while he's traveling, here's the other thing talking about. So this is where. So one of the best things in our marriage is when Becky and I decided that we're just going to tell people where we need help, and we're not going to be embarrassed about it. But I think a lot of couples, because again, we have this idea that we don't talk about this before you're married, that's just going to carry it into, we don't talk about this after we're married. And until we get to a point where people are willing to say, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to have healthy sexual intimacy with my spouse. Can someone please help me? At least, and again, this is just our experience, we did not do a good job of figuring it out on our own. It wasn't until we got to the point where, and this is actually, my wife did most of the legwork, and she told me, and I said, okay. But she found podcasts, she found experts, she found books, and like not just like, I'm listening to this expert. It's actually like I'm putting myself in a situation where I can have a phone call and talk to this expert and ask them questions, and then put into practice the expert advice that they're giving, like professional counseling, that we were able to recognize, identify, come up with a plan for healing and good practice, and now get to a place where our marriage is in a much healthier place. And we can now start being able to work with our kids in that. But if we hadn't ever done that, we'd still be in the same mess that we were in that first 7 years. So people we have to be okay opening up and talking about things that make us uncomfortable and admitting that we have problems and that we need help. And then we can start pouring into each other and really create these foundations. And again, there's so much about the kingdom life that we're supposed to look towards marriages to understand how it works. Like even we talk about interaction in the church. Your older women as mothers, older men as fathers, younger women as brothers and sisters. That's family stuff. It's assuming we understand how healthy families look. And saying, hey, look, you understand how this healthy family works? Act that way in the church. But if we don't understand how healthy families work, then how can we look at that and say, okay, here's how we're supposed to treat each other in the church? Super important. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, as we talk about educating our kids, it's part of a bigger process of educating them on the worth piece, on their identity in Christ and how
Yeah.
it's bound up in that, and also showing them and demonstrating grace. But on the other piece is, too, that understanding what real love is, and that people aren't here for your pleasure, but they're here to be loved, and they're created in the image of God. And so when we get to that part where we're talking about sex, it's not just a physical act, or it's not in the place where they're here to meet my need,
Yeah.
or they're here for my pleasure, but they're here to be loved, where we give ourselves to each other. And it gives greater importance to that, rather than just teach them, this is the physical act, here's how
Yeah.
it works, wait
Well,
till your marriage.
It's like our relationship with Christ. Our relationship with Christ isn't about what we can get out of him. It's about the love and the respect and what it is that he did for us, So, okay. And so what's one of the themes that we're going to look at as we're going through the Old Testament is how the Old Testament looks at marriage and healthy marriage and that kind of stuff. So more of these themes will pop out, and I'm looking forward to kind of pulling something together as we go. I think I'm done talking about Genesis chapter 2 for now. So what I want to do next week is I want to look at, I believe that there's 3 other passages that are similar to Genesis 2, and that they help us inform what's going on in Genesis 1. Those being Proverbs chapter 8, Psalm 104, and Job 38. And so I want to take those passages and do the same kind of thing, where we're going to look at that, and that's going to inform our understanding of what is happening in Genesis chapter 1. And I will, at that point, specifically be addressing some of these faith science things that I've been dodging around up until now. And I only want to do a couple weeks because I ultimately don't think it's super important. I wanted to make sure I hit this stuff in here that I think is far more important than what the Scripture is actually pointing us to. But I do want to talk about it because it's something that has been really impactful for me. And then we will get into Genesis chapter 3, and we'll start addressing the fall. Because remember, this is all coming at this perspective of those Israelites who are coming up out of Egypt are now getting the true understanding of the world. And Genesis 1 and 2 set everything up looking really nice. And they're looking around saying, yeah, okay, what happened? Because we're not needing it anymore. And then chapter 3 is going to be where we start answering that question. Okay, I'm going to close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. And just thank you that, we got it. We have the Word. We got the church. We have your Spirit. We have a covenant relationship of marriage where you have brought people together in such a way that we can, we can have a godly marriage. There's so many people out in the world that all marriage, that just no matter, you can't have a good marriage. All marriages are terrible. We just do the best we can. But you have something very profound for us, and we can be the husbands and wives that you desire us to be, and we can be the parents, not because of anything that's in us, but because you've given us everything so that we can do that. And through what it is that you have done in us, out of response to that, we can walk with you in these aspects of life and not just have a really wonderful relationship with another human being, but have a relationship that actually shows people what it looks like to have a relationship with your son. And we just pray that at the end of the day, that would be the testimony of our marriages here at Calvary, that if people want to know, what does it mean, what does it look like to have a relationship with Christ, they can see it here in the marriages that we have with our spouses. And we pray these things.